Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 3 lecture. So let's get back into narrative. Last week, as I mentioned, we covered the basics, the most important elements that we expect to find in most narratives, whether they are fictional or nonfiction, whether they are novels, short stories, news stories, TV shows, movies. Most narratives contain those basic elements. So we should always be looking for those. As we start to read more and more narratives in our books, always think about setting, characters, obviously the narrative point, the overall theme or meaning, but also think about point of view. Who's telling the story? Whose perspective are we getting? All of those elements matter. But this week, I want us to get a little bit deeper, a little bit more involved. So I want to talk a little bit about close reading. Some of you might be familiar with this as a practice or a technique. As I said, it's often used in upper level English classes, particularly when students are studying and analyzing literature. So we're not doing a ton of that in 101, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on close reading. But as we're working on narratives, as we're getting more comfortable with this writing style, I do think close reading can help. It's a way to dig a little bit deeper. It's a way to find connections in the narratives that we read, patterns, and sometimes by close reading, we can arrive at a much larger and greater understanding of the overall text. So basically, close reading just means what it says. You are reading very, very closely, but you're looking for specific elements, and typically, you stay within the text. So what does that mean? Well, you guys know this from previous experience. Typically, when we read narratives, or when we read anything for school, but particularly a story, we like to make personal connections, if possible. We like to relate what we're reading to our own lives, our own experiences. And that's fine. That's good. That's usually encouraged. Another thing we like to do is to think about history, to look for historical context. So, for example, shooting an elephant, one of the first narratives we looked at, it would be a good thing for you to know a little bit about the history surrounding that text, the history of the British Raj or British, colonialism on the Indian subcontinent. It would be good to know a little bit about that history in order to understand everything in that narrative. So we can do that. We like doing that because it's relatively easy. So in previous classes, when you guys have been asked to talk about narrative, you'll often look up the historical context because you can find that on Wikipedia or just through a quick Google search. You might talk a little bit about those personal connections that we mentioned. You might talk a little bit about the author's bio. Well, here's what was happening in the author's life. That might be interesting, and that information is also usually easy to find. So these are the things that we like to do. We turn to historical context, maybe social or cultural context. We turn to biography of the author, and then we turn to ourselves. And we say, hey, this makes me think of this thing that happened to me one time. Or this character reminds me of my dad. This character reminds me of my best friend, whatever. And that's all fine. I'm not criticizing those practices. But when we close read, we're really paying attention to language, first and foremost. We are focused on the language in the text. And what that means is we have to stay within the text. We don't do all of those things that I just described. We don't turn to personal connections. We don't look up the history or the author's biography because none of that stuff really has a whole lot to do with language. That's other stuff, good stuff, interesting stuff, potentially useful stuff. But close reading is an activity geared towards a better understanding of language, the patterns, the rhythms, and the meanings of language. So we have to stay focused on the language. language. That's what we mean by not leaving the text. Because typically we're quick to leave the text. We're quick to jump back into ourselves, right? We all do this. We jump into the history. We jump into Wikipedia. But all of that involves leaving the text. With close reading, if we're going to do it in the traditional way, we have to stay locked in on the language of the text. So I listed a few things in the week 3 overview, some things to look for, some elements that we can look for and analyze when we're close reading. So all of these elements are directly tied to language. And by looking for these things and thinking about these things, we can really come up with some cool conclusions. We can find a lot of new stuff. You might be surprised at how much you can come up with just through a quick session of close reading. So let's just go through those key things I listed in the overview, beginning with vocabulary, also known as word choice. So think about individual words in the narratives or in any text that you read. Obviously, right now, we're focused on narratives. So this might seem sort of impossible, or maybe you think, I don't have time to analyze every individual word. And of course, no one does. But you're looking for words that jump out at you for some reason. Words that might seem strange. Words that you might not be familiar with. Definitely notice if you see certain words getting repeated. Repetition always matters. It's almost always intentional. So if you notice repetition, make a note of it. Remember our annotation strategies from week 1. When you're close reading, you'll have a lot of new annotations to write as you read, because you'll make a lot of new discoveries and you'll come up with a lot of new ideas. But also think about a couple of words in particular when you're thinking about word choice. Think about denotations versus connotations. And I talk about these terms in the week 3 overview. Denotation is easy. That just means the dictionary definition of a word. And please, guys, by all means, use the internet anytime you stumble upon a word that you don't recognize, a word that you don't know. Look it up. Look it up. Online dictionaries work fine. And it will take you, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, depending on how fast you type and how fast your internet connection is. You'll be able to find the definition of a word in mere seconds. So there's never an excuse for not knowing a word. Not in 2021. Maybe 30 years ago when you'd have to find an actual hardbound dictionary and look everything up. But now you don't have that excuse that, I couldn't find out what the word means. Everybody can find out any word in the English language in a matter of seconds. That's one of the great things about the internet. So take advantage. So if you find a word you don't know, look up the definition and then maybe jot down that definition to help you understand. But also realize that the dictionary definition of a word is not the only thing that affects how that word operates in a text. So the dictionary definition is not the only thing that matters to us as readers. Another thing that matters is the connotation. The connotation simply means what thoughts or associations does the word bring to mind when you see it or hear it. And there's a difference between denotation and connotation. You can always look up a definition, but connotations, those are more subjective. Those are more personal. Sometimes they're almost more emotional. Some words might make us feel a certain way. And the way they make us feel or what they make us think might not be based entirely on their dictionary definition. So let me give you an example. And again, authors are aware of this when they're choosing what words to use. So I want you to think about 2 words that have very similar dictionary definitions or denotations. The word group, we all know that word, and then the word clique. Not like I'm clicking my fingers, but CLIQUE. And we're probably familiar with that word. If you look up the word clique, the way I just spelled it, online, you'll notice that it has a definition that's very similar to group. In fact, the beginning of the definition is a small group of people. But then the definition goes on to say this is a shared group, they have shared interests, they hang out together, but they do not readily allow others to join them. So that is a part of the definition, and that's a very big part of what a lot of us think about when we think about the connotation of this word. The word group doesn't really have positive or negative connotations. We don't typically have strong emotions about the word group. We all know what it means. It gets used all the time. It's very common. So it's almost a neutral word. But the word clique has kind of negative connotations nowadays. A lot of people might think about, school cafeterias and all the different groups being sort of segregated from one another. All the different groups keeping to themselves. A lot of times with the word clique, we think about exclusivity. We think about groups excluding others. You're not good enough for us. You can't hang out with us. So some of this is emotional. Some of this might be based on our own experiences. I still think about what my high school lunchroom looked like a million years ago when I was in high school. And I also remember a conversation I had with my nephew who's in high school now. And we were talking about the differences between like the year 2000 and the year that we're in now. And one thing that he said, unprompted, after hearing about my own experiences, he said, yeah, schools aren't as cliquey anymore. He used that word, not me. He said schools aren't as cliquey as they sounded like they were a million years ago when you were young. And I don't know if that's true. I mean, I take his word for it. But again, he's using the word the way a lot of us do. This idea that, a clique is exclusive, they're kind of mean, and they don't mingle with others. And yeah, that's not completely separate from the definition, but it's not really the main part of the definition. The main part of the definition is just a group of people who like the same stuff. So a clique doesn't have to be negative, but we often have a negative connotation associated with it. Right or wrong, we often feel that way when we hear that word or when we read that word. So authors know that. I mean, authors are masters of language. So when they choose words, when they choose a word with a very specific connotation, they know what they're doing. They're trying to create a specific response in their readers, perhaps. Or they want us to think a certain way about the people in this clique. Because if they just wanted a neutral word that wouldn't really bring out any connotations, they could just say group. But if they say clique, there's a reason. So we need to think about that reason. Another example, two words that have similar definitions but different connotations. Think about the words youthful versus childlike or juvenile. If you call somebody in their 30s like me, late 30s like me, youthful, that's got positive connotations. That's a compliment, right? You're telling me that I look young, that I seem young. That's great. I'm going to take that as a compliment. But if you told me that I am childlike, I'm probably going to be mildly insulted by that, even though the words kind of mean the same thing. I mean, they have at least similar definitions. If I am childlike, that means that I seem young, but that has negative connotations. Now it sounds like you're telling me that I'm immature, that, I don't know how to take care of myself. The same with the word juvenile. If you say, oh, that person looks sort of juvenile or has a juvenile appearance, that's got negative connotations. People are not going to take that in a positive way. They're not going to view that as a compliment. So there's a lot of examples of this. Bossy, versus assertive. Right? The word assertive, that has positive connotations. It's good to take charge. It's good to be assertive. But if you're bossy, well, nobody really likes somebody who's bossy, right? So even though those words really kind of mean very similar things, they have drastically different connotations. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at individual words. Again, connotations go beyond the literal. They go sort of beyond the actual definition, and they tap into sort of emotions, associations. So there's a lot of interesting things that can happen with that. So yeah, just always pay attention to words, weird words, powerful words, words that you don't know, words that just seem really important, or words that have very specific connotations. All right, let's move on to imagery. We're going to talk more about imagery next week when we discuss descriptive writing. So in week 4, we're going to enhance our descriptive writing abilities because description, as you can probably imagine, is a very important part of narrative. So we're going to kind of get back into imagery during week 4, but I want to introduce it now as we do a little bit of close reading because it's a huge part of noticing language. Noticing imagery is a big part of what we're doing here. So imagery is a broad term, and it refers to any words or phrases or sentences that make readers use their 5 senses. And we all know the 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and what did I forget? Taste. That's right. So sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. Those are our 5 senses, and imagery taps into those in various ways. Now, just based on the word and based on the fact that sight is our most commonly used sense, we might think that imagery only applies to our sense of sight. And obviously, it often does. But it can also include those other senses as well. So a lot of words and phrases will make us see certain things. And we kind of talk about this as like mental images. Really good imagery will kind of help you to draw pictures in your mind. Really good imagery will allow you to see what is actually happening in the narrative. But other words and phrases might make you smell certain things, or they might make you taste certain things, or hear certain things, or even touch certain things. So imagery can operate on all of those levels. And typically in narrative, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, we expect to find at least some imagery. So what I did for week 3, I posted a couple of poems under presentation and the week 3 overview. So this is not part of our reading assignment for the week, and it's not really an official formal thing, but I just wanted you guys to look at those 2 poems. They're both by famous American poets. One's by Robert Frost, the other is by Sylvia Plath. Poems are really good to use when you're conducting a close reading, because poems are full of imagery. They're full of really interesting uses of language. So you can always find stuff to dig into when you're looking at poems. But I also picked those 2 poems in particular because they're both telling stories. So they both qualify as narratives. I have some other examples of narratives in the presentation as well. But when you're doing close reading, you might want to focus on those 2 poems. You have links to both. You can just read them at your leisure, but look for some of this stuff. Look for imagery. Look for words or phrases that make you see things. You're also, especially in Out, the Frost poem, you're going to be able to hear things. You might even be able to smell things. So look for imagery and also think about word choice. Those poems will give you a good chance to practice some of this stuff. All right, let's move on to point of view. We talked about this last week. So when we were discussing point of view previously, I basically told you guys to remember the differences between first person point of view. That's a personal narrative typically. With first person, we're going to have I and me. Typically, we're going to have the protagonist of the story telling the story. So the protagonist will also be the narrator, and that character is telling his or her own story. So that's important for you to keep track of as you're thinking about language. What kind of language does this narrator use? So you always need to ask yourself, who's the narrator? Do I have a first-person narrator who's actually the main character? Or do I have a third-person narrator? And we have kind of two styles of third-person narration. Like I mentioned last week, we have the omniscient third-person narrator who is godlike and knows everything, potentially about all the characters, the setting, everything that's going on. And then we have more limited third-person narrators. So remember, a third-person narrator is not in the action. They're more distant. They're more removed. They're not one of the characters. They're not the person that, the story kind of revolves around. They're outside the action. They're outside of those events of the plot. So that could be an omniscient, godlike narrator, or it could just be a third-person narrator who knows some things, but not all things. But typically those third-person narrators are more separate. And some third-person narrators might kind of draw a lot of attention to themselves. They might almost sort of function as characters. Other third-person narrators don't really want the spotlight. They want all the focus on the events of the plot, the characters, everything that's going on. So think about it. What kind of narrator do we see in the text that we're reading? If it's a first-person narrator, what do we think about that character? Do we like them? But also think about the language they use. What is their tone? What is their manner of speaking? This might be based on education level, profession, where they live. But this gets even more interesting, I think, if you have a third-person narrator, an omniscient narrator, or just somebody who knows some but not everything. Look to see if there's some kind of gap or disjunction or almost like a tension between the way the narrator talks, the language of the narrator, versus the language of the characters. Sometimes the narrator sounds very different than the characters. That's one way that we know that we're getting, exposition or some level of narration, we're not just hearing the characters talk. So think about differences in language. Do we have one style of speaking on display with the narrator and then a different style of speaking when we hear the characters? Or does the narrator sound like the characters? So these can all be interesting things to consider. But always ask yourself, who is the narrator? That's step one. And then ask yourself, where is the narrator? Is the narrator in the story? Or is the narrator outside the action? That's going to help you to determine if it's first person or third person. But again, pronouns will help with that too. And once you've decided who the narrator is and where the narrator is located, you can start making some decisions about the narrator's language. How does the narrator sound? And does the point of view shift? Do we actually get different perspectives at different times? Do we occupy the minds and maybe even the voices of multiple characters? Or do we maintain one consistent perspective or one consistent point of view throughout? So just some questions to ask yourself. Also, characterization, characters, another element that we talked about last week, but just think about it a little bit more when you're close reading. Ask yourself, how are these characters being presented to us? How are they described? You can tell a lot by the description provided for a character. If a character is presented, again, think about connotations. What words are used to present the character? Do they have negative connotations or do they have positive connotations? Think about the way the characters talk. Think about the ways that third-person narrators might talk about the characters. All of that matters. You need to form opinions about these characters and about the language they use. And then we also mentioned symbolism. So we're going to get into this a little bit more next week as well. But you guys are probably familiar with the idea of symbols, right? A symbol is simply a thing in a text that represents larger things, larger meanings. So it could be an object, it could be a person, it could be a place, but if it represents something bigger, if it stands in for something bigger that's even kind of outside of the text, then you know you're dealing with symbolism. And we see symbolism all the time, right? Think about the American flag. That's an object that represents an entire country. So that's a pretty important symbol, and of course we're all familiar with it. Think about roses. Red roses are often taken as symbols that represent love, romantic love. There's a lot of these. What else did I include? Oh yeah, apple pie, like the American flag, is often thought to kind of represent America. So a lot of symbols, they do important work because they're representing maybe like abstract concepts. Like it's hard to really put love directly in a text. You need a symbol that represents love, or you need characters talking about love or doing things that seem to be that can be associated with love, because love is an abstract concept. It's not exactly tangible. You can't hold it. It's not a piece of paper. It's not a pen. It's an abstract concept that we keep in our minds. But that means that individual symbols that represent that abstract concept, they become very important. So when you're reading, always pay attention to symbols, right? The skull and crossbones, that symbolizes danger. So when you see that on like rat poison, that's indicating that, humans shouldn't use it. So again, we know these symbols, they're kind of baked in to our culture. But when you're reading, look for additional symbols, not just these obvious easy ones, but look for anything else that seems to represent some larger idea or maybe an abstract concept that isn't just in the text. It operates throughout the world, throughout our society. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about style. We're not going to get too far into this, but of course, if we're thinking about language, we have to think about individual authors' writing style. And this is sometimes a little bit hard, and we do this more at the upper levels, but we can do a little bit of it here. Mainly, you just need to pay attention to the length and the rhythm of individual sentences. So we're really talking about sentence structure here. And different authors use different structures. So you might notice in some texts, you might notice really long, complicated sentences. You should make a note of that. In other cases, you might notice that the author uses a lot of short, choppy sentences. You should make a note of that. In some cases, you might see a balance struck between long, complex sentences and then shorter, kind of easier sentences. But just get a general sense of the rhythm. How do these sentences flow? Do they sound good? Do they flow together? Or is the reading experience kind of difficult and choppy and awkward? Also, once again, think about repetition. If you notice that certain structures or certain words or certain phrases or maybe even entire sentences are getting repeated frequently, That matters. That's not a mistake on the author's part or the editor's part. That's not an oversight. That repetition is very intentional, and you need to figure out why it's there. What is it doing? Usually it's there for emphasis. So why is it so important? Why is this repeated word or phrase so important? You need to figure that out. Okay, that's pretty much it, but I do want to talk about figurative language a little bit. And this is another concept that we will return to next week when we're talking about description. So when we're getting deeper into description, we'll definitely be using a lot of imagery and figurative language. But I just want to go over some basics here today so we're a little bit more comfortable working with figurative language next week. So figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal. It goes beyond, in some ways, like our everyday reality. And it's trying to express a larger meaning, or it's trying to express something more complex. So you guys, when you're analyzing language, you need to be aware of literal meaning versus figurative meaning. Because that's two different levels of language. And literal meaning is usually pretty easy, I should say, is usually easy to figure out. You know, if you're reading something, you know, and it's relatively easy to read, you're going to know the literal meaning of the sentence by the end of the sentence. But figurative meaning can sometimes be very complex. It can be a little bit more subjective, and it's often very, very interesting. So I've just listed a few examples of the most common types of figurative language. I just want you guys to be familiar with these and to be comfortable with these, both as a reader trying to identify the use of figurative language in the narratives that we read, and then later as a writer when it's time for you to actually use some of these things in your own essays. So let's just start with metaphors and similes. They're very similar, but they are slightly different. But they're doing the same basic thing, which is they are comparing two unlike things by essentially saying that one is the other, or at least one is like the other. But again, we are leaving the literal behind at this point. So a typical metaphor would be something like this. She is drowning in a sea of grief. That's a kind of popular phrase that gets repeated a lot. That's a metaphor. That's not meant to be taken literally. So if I'm talking about a relative of mine who recently experienced a great loss and she's in mourning, and I say that sentence, I don't mean she's literally drowning, right? I am using figurative speech. I'm using figurative language here to express my idea in a slightly more complex, interesting way. So I'm saying she's drowning in a sea of grief, just simply meaning she's overcome with grief. So it almost kind of feels like she's drowning, perhaps. That might be the sensation that's kind of created for her, but she's not literally drowning. But the structure of a metaphor is such that one thing is said to be the other thing. I'm saying that her grieving process is drowning. That's a metaphor. Another example from Shakespeare. The whole world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Now, in Shakespeare's day, actors were called players. So he's referring to actors there. Because they performed in plays. So they were called players. But again, we're not dealing with literal meaning here. The world is not literally a stage. We know that. But he's making a larger point here. And I kind of mentioned this last week. All humans think about their lives as narratives. That's the point Shakespeare's making, actually. We always think about our lives as stories. And we are characters in the stories. All the people we know, they are the actors in this movie that is our life. So that's basically the idea that he's expressing. But he's doing it metaphorically. He's doing it figuratively. The world is a stage. All the people in the world are actors. We know those things aren't literally true, but we know what he means. He's operating on a figurative level, and it makes sense to most people. Now, a simile, just like a metaphor, is a comparison between two unlike things. But as you probably learned in some boring English class years ago, what makes similes different from metaphors is the use of the words like or as. So the same basic comparative work is getting done, but with a simile, we have slightly different word choice. So for example, I move fast like a cheetah. That's a simile. I am comparing myself to a cheetah. Now, literally, that's nonsense. No human can run as fast as a cheetah, and we know that. But I'm making a larger point here, which is I'm really fast, and I'm not in reality, so I would never actually say that simile. But, okay, with a fast person, like a track star, okay, yeah, comparing that person to a cheetah on a figurative level, that makes sense. Cheetahs are fast. This person is fast. Okay. But similes kind of hedge their bets a little bit. So like I said, a metaphor just says that one unlike thing is the other, right? The world is a stage. Not the world is like a stage, just the world is a stage. But with a simile, we're not saying that they're exactly alike. We're saying that they're similar. So I'm not saying I am a cheetah. I'm saying that I'm like a cheetah. I run fast like a cheetah. So it's kind of a small distinction, but it does matter. So I want you guys to look for similes as you're reading through Shooting an Elephant, Salvation, and the narratives that we're reading here in week 3. You're definitely going to find some in Shooting an Elephant. Actually, I'm going to give you guys one just because it's fun and very, very vivid. But give me a moment to grab my book. I'm coming right back. So I just want to make sure that my pagination is right here because I used to have a different edition. Hold on. Sorry, I forgot what page it's on. Okay. So if you look on okay, I finally found it. On page 284 in our edition, on page 284 in Shooting an Elephant, listen to this simile. If the elephant charged and I missed him with his rifle, I should have about as much chance as a toad under a steamroller. So notice what he's saying here. This is a very creative way of expressing his fear of what might happen if the elephant tramples him. So he's saying if I missed, I had the same chance as a toad under a steamroller. So that's a very vivid way of expressing this idea. So again, he's comparing himself to a toad, but he's using in this case the word as to make it clear that he's not exactly like the toad. He's similar to the toad. What's going to happen to him is similar to what would happen to a toad under a steamroller. So look for more examples like that. Look for more comparisons. Look for metaphors and similes in the narratives that we read because they'll all have at least a couple. So those are good to be familiar with and get comfortable maybe using a few yourself once you're working on your own narratives. Personification is another common type of figurative language that most of us are familiar with. So this just means that we are attributing human qualities to non-human things. So we do this a lot. Opportunity knocked at his door. That's a common phrase. That's personification. Opportunity does not have hands. Opportunity cannot literally knock on a door, but we know what that means. Opportunity has presented itself to you, just like somebody coming to your door. So we understand personification. Typically, the sun greeted me this morning. The sun can't actually do that, but that just means that you woke up and saw sunlight pouring through your window. So personification can work for inanimate objects and also animals, anything that's not human, but you're giving it human qualities. And again, that serves a figurative purpose. That gives us another way to express ideas in more creative, interesting ways. And let's see, hyperbole, we probably know that. Intentional exaggeration. I've told you a million times to clean up your room. Perhaps we've heard that as either a child or a parent. That's not a literal statement, obviously. We haven't said it 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times. It might feel like we have, or it might feel like we've heard it that many times. But we're just making the larger point that, hey, we've said it multiple times. So it's just a way to really emphasize certain emotions or ideas, facts, events, and to really, drive home the significance of certain things, because often we exaggerate to make a point about how, extreme a certain feeling is or how important a particular moment is. So if I say, I'm so hungry, I could eat a horse, that's not literal, I hope. I don't really want to eat an entire horse, and it would probably be physically impossible for me to eat an entire horse by myself. But I'm just trying to make the point that I'm very, very hungry. I'm just trying to emphasize my hunger by using an intentional exaggeration. And then finally, I can't remember if I included this in the week 3 overview, but allusion is the final term I'll mention today. Allusion with an A, not with an I. So we don't mean some kind of false impression or a mirage. We mean allusion with an A, and that means a reference to people, things, or events that are outside the text. So these are references that, most people are going to understand, but they're not references to other characters or events of the plot. They're references to things that exist outside the text. Maybe other characters from different narratives or things from pop culture, things that readers will recognize. So, some easy examples. I was surprised to find that his nose was growing like Pinocchio. We know who Pinocchio is, but Pinocchio is probably not a character in the narrative that we're reading at that particular time. So if we hear about him, that's an illusion. But it's there to make a point, it's there to make a comparison, and it's there to help us understand. Or chocolate was her Achilles heel. That's a reference to Achilles, a character from ancient Greek epics. He's probably not a character in the narrative that you're reading, but we know who he is, and the Achilles heel is like the fatal flaw. It's the fatal weakness that a lot of ancient heroes were said to have. So Achilles was supposed to be like indestructible except for his heel. That was the one way that you could hurt him. But now that term gets thrown around so often, we usually know what it means. Or if you're reading something and it's compared to the Garden of Eden, we know what that means. We know what that's a reference to, even if the Garden of Eden is not actually in the text that we're reading. So sometimes allusions do important work as well. All right, so that's enough for today. We're going to come back to some of these ideas next week as we get started on descriptive writing. So I hope you guys enjoy some of these narratives that we're reading. Let me just say a final thought before signing off about discussion posts. So far, you guys are doing fine, but just let me give you a warning, because you probably have already noticed that there's a lot of stuff online about shooting an elephant. There's a lot of stuff online about salvation and some of these other narratives that we're reading. I'm aware of that, and I just want you guys to be aware of the fact that it's very easy for me to tell if you are lifting material from these essay mills online or these, Spark Notes type websites, and there's a lot of those out there. I know you guys are perhaps familiar with some. And look, sometimes reading a quick summary is okay. If you're confused about something, maybe you want to check out some stuff online, but don't use anything that you find online in your discussion posts. And if you do, it's going to get flagged by our plagiarism detection software. So I don't have to do anything, even though it's easy with a Google search to usually find the source that you used. But if you're pulling stuff from a website, our software in Web Campus is going to find it, it's going to show it to me, and then I'm going to have to, give you a failing grade for that assignment, because of course that is plagiarism. So I just want your own ideas, your own observations, your own interpretations in these discussion posts. And if you're having trouble with anything, if you're having trouble getting the book, if you have any questions at all, let me know, and I will see you next week.